So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honour for me to introduce to you the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. It's a particular pleasure and honour for me because I'm from her country, and I'm here in my UN capacity, of course, but I happen to be... Now, this needs a little bit of explanation about countries because nobody really understands quite what it is about countries in Britain. In the UN, of course, a country means an independent member state. In the British context, England, Scotland and Wales are all seen as countries, and it explains why, to the irritation of most of the world, we have separate teams competing for the World Cup. But Scotland is a country which is part of a bigger country. And now normally it is a particular pleasure because on the whole, national movements and nationalists are not friends of the UN, and you don't often have representatives of national movements coming when nationalists, and rarer still is it that they come and discuss human rights. But there's something different about Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon is going to explain that. And it actually goes back a long way, from back to 1320, the Declaration of Our Birth, which is about freedom, but it was also about accountability. And then there was the Scottish Enlightenment of the late 18th century, Adam Smith and the rule of law, and David Hume and personal freedom. So there's a long tradition of human rights in Scotland. And in the last few years, the Scottish government, headed by Nicola Sturgeon, has made some extremely powerful words and statements about human rights, which is very reassuring to see at a time where we see from our global perspective here at the UN a backlash against human rights in so many forms. And yet it's very nice to have, because frankly that backlash has penetrated even Europe, and it is very good to see and to hear words that are very supportive of human rights from north of the border in Britain. So without much more, perhaps you could very kindly tell us about how your vision of human rights for Scotland and how your government is taking the human rights agenda forward at this difficult global moment.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming along here today to hear a little bit about Scotland and our human rights agenda. And thank you very much to you, Andrew, for facilitating this discussion. It's always a pleasure to be here at the United Nations. Andrew said rightly that we live in a world today where worryingly human rights appear in many parts of the world to be under real pressure, and where we are seeing a regression in human rights protections. And Europe and indeed the UK is not immune from that. Brexit, which is the topic preoccupying everybody in the UK right now, raises some concerns about possible regression on human rights protections in the years to come. So that's the context in which Scotland, a relatively small country, has very firmly decided to seek to be a leader in human rights protections domestically within our own country, but also to do what we can to further the dialogue and debate internationally. As I say, we're a small country. We're not yet an independent country, although I hope that changes in the future and we may be independently represented at the UN in years to come. But although we're not an independent country, we seek to play our part in advancing human rights internationally. We, for example, take part with the UN in a Women in Conflict programme where we offer support and assistance to women from North Africa and the Middle East in conflict resolution and peace building. We've recently launched a Scottish Human Rights Defender Fellowship where we offer Scotland as something of a sanctuary for human rights defenders from other parts of the world to come and reflect and to build their own resilience and capacity. So these are just a couple of examples of the work we're seeking to do globally. But domestically, and I'm a great believer that countries can only be treated seriously internationally if they lead by example and take the right steps within their own countries. We have in Scotland what's called a national planning framework. That is the framework by which we assess the success or otherwise of our economy and our society, the success of initiatives that government and the wider public sector take to grow the economy and to make the country fairer. And for the first time, we have now embedded into that framework human rights protections. So human rights protections has become and will increasingly become one of the measures by which we assess the success of our country. And that is important because for government, for politicians, it means that human rights protections are not optional. They are part and parcel of how we do governance and of how we take forward the initiatives that are important to us. We've also recently had a piece of work done for us which was inspired really by some of the concerns that arise out of Brexit in the UK. We want to make sure that Scotland doesn't fall behind in human rights protections as a result of the UK leaving the European Union. So we asked a very respected human rights professional, Professor Alan Miller, to lead a piece of work for us to look at how Scotland can ensure that we keep pace with current European human rights protections. Secondly, that even if for a period Scotland is not in the European Union, we adopt any human rights protections that come from the European Union. And thirdly, how Scotland can, in practical terms, be a leader in human rights. And one of the main recommendations of that report is that Scotland should, over the next few years, create a new statutory framework for human rights. And that will encompass the incorporation of some UN treaties, for example, into our domestic law. And the first step we're taking along that road is to incorporate fully into our domestic law the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we are seeking in a very real, practical, legal sense to embed the human rights obligations on governments now and in the future very firmly. And that, just to conclude, I suppose is us in Scotland seeking to do domestically what we then hope to help encourage other countries to do internationally. So that just sets out the scene in a very brief way, but I'm obviously happy to get into more detail on some of these issues with you over the next little while.
No, thank you so much. And before I open the floor, maybe I could just ask a couple of questions. I mean, one of the great problems of human rights, facing the whole human rights movement is immigration and migration, and the fears, vastly exaggerated though we think they are, of immigration, that they've been whipped up by populists and have created a very, very unfriendly atmosphere in Europe and indeed in the country we're in now by whipping up fears and getting people terribly scared, even though the relative movements are actually quite small. It's in Europe, so people talk about 1 or 2% of the population. It's not so massive, and yet it's been taken up, and nationalists everywhere are using this as a stick to push back against us all. Your party, your government, is not at all hostile to immigrants. It's quite the opposite, either from Europe or beyond. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about, at this time where sort of the drawbridge is being pulled up and walls are being built, or not built, what do you feel about that?
I'm happy to do that. Let me just briefly take on this issue of the term nationalism. My party wants Scotland to become an independent country, and therefore we are described as Scottish nationalists. I've never been very comfortable with the word nationalist, not because I am uncomfortable with what my party advocates or stands for. My discomfort comes from the fact that the word nationalist, that there is that one word in the English language that is used to describe different viewpoints on a very wide spectrum, from far-right racists, economic nationalists, through to what my party advocates, which is self-government for a country. It's not based on any considerations of ethnicity. Our view is anybody is welcome to come to Scotland. Where you come from doesn't matter. If you want to make Scotland your home, you are welcome, and we want you to make a contribution. And I want Scotland to be independent because it gives us the ability to shape better the kind of country we are and the kind of role we want Scotland to play in the world. And just to illustrate the point about self-government with the very current example of Brexit, Scotland, when the Brexit referendum happened in 2016, voted to stay in the European Union. But because we are part of the UK, we face being removed from the European Union against our wishes. If Scotland was an independent country, that's a decision we could take for ourselves. So that really highlights and illustrates this power of self-government. But it's not nationalism in the sense that many people understand that term nationalist from other parts of the world. And again, to come to Andrew's question, my party in a United Kingdom context is probably the most pro-immigration party of all. We are pro-immigration for two broad reasons. Firstly, I believe as a matter of principle that one of the greatest ways of fostering better understanding between different peoples and different countries, frankly, one of the best ways of promoting peace globally is to allow people to travel, to experience life in different countries, and to develop that greater understanding. So I'm a proponent in principle of freedom of movement and people experiencing different countries and different cultures. But there's also a practical reason for Scotland. Scotland is a country, and we're not unique in this sense, but the demographics of Scotland are quite challenging. Our birth rate is not growing at a fast enough rate. Our population is ageing, which is a good thing. People are living longer. But we face a situation in future that if we don't attract people to come and live in Scotland, our working age population may decline. It was in decline about 20 years ago, and migration from other parts of Europe reversed that. So if we suddenly pull up the drawbridge, we will damage our own economic interests. So we are pro-migration from a principled perspective, but also from a very practical perspective. And, you know, we make that case very strongly. I wish more politicians in the UK, across Europe and across the world would make that case much more powerfully and strongly than they do.
No, indeed. Something you did I like very, very much, actually. The day after the Brexit referendum, you wrote a letter to every European living in Scotland to reassure them that they were still welcome there, whatever the national referendum had happened, had reflected. But I mentioned the great challenge of migration and immigration as a human rights issue, but another one, something that is a major concern for us, and therefore a great priority, is the shrinking of civil society space around the world and the pressure on NGOs and human rights defenders. And this is something that, as we see around the world, there's more and more repression and silencing. Several countries have adopted laws to prevent NGOs from being able to operate, to being able to stop them from raising funds from abroad, and essentially it's a way of silencing their voices. You have, I don't know much about it, but I know you've come up with a programme for defenders and how Scotland might be able to assist people in a very difficult position elsewhere.
Absolutely. And that is one way. It's a relatively small way for a country of Scotland's size, but it's exactly a response to that situation. We are acutely aware of the pressures, the very grave pressures that human rights defenders face in many different parts of the world. So we have developed a Scottish Human Rights Defender Fellowship, where we offer the opportunity to human rights defenders from different parts of the world to come to Scotland to have a bit of a break from what they are facing in their own countries, to develop networks outside their own countries with other human rights defenders, to learn from the experiences of others. And I hope to get a sense of support and solidarity, and a reminder that there are many countries and many people across the world that stand with them in their human rights struggles at home. So it's a very tangible way of expressing that solidarity at a time when many NGOs and human rights defenders are under the gravest of pressure in their own countries.
Great, thank you. I'd like to open the floor. We have some very distinguished ambassadors here who are great friends of our office, Morocco, Austria, and others who have been very supportive of the Human Rights Office. But if anybody would like, actually, sir, if you're asking Ambassador Hilal of Morocco.
Thank you very much, dear Andrew, for this opportunity. Madam First Minister of Scotland, I would like to, first of all, welcome here among our group, and I would like to congratulate you for two reasons. The first one is that it's the first time here in New York that chief of regional or local government is coming to interact with UN members about question of human rights. Normally, it's always the head of states, it's ministers, but local government, that's the first time, at least that's what I remember. And your gesture is highly appreciated because we believe that, of course, in one way or one part, the government are the first responsible for protecting and promoting human rights. But locally, this is also very important. Local governments have their own responsibility, their own obligation. And feeling or seeing that local governments are now ownershiping the task of protecting and promoting human rights, it's a good practice. That should be followed by many countries. And in time that we see that, well, in Europe we are talking about regions. That's very good. In the rest of the world, there is more countries that are giving power or devoting local powers. But the question of human rights is never devoted, is never visible in this devotion of authority. And we appreciate it really very well, especially as Andrew said in his preliminary remarks that human rights are under attack all around the world. And we cannot accept this. NGOs, who are the vibrant people that are risking their lives to promote and to defend human rights, are also under pushed to be silent, not allowed to get funding, which is very important. So this presence here today in New York is we appreciate it, and we are very happy with this exchange of views. That's the first reason why I wanted to congratulate you, and I'm very happy to be here this morning. The second reason is that normally Geneva is the Mecca of human rights. Geneva is always where there is meetings on human rights, and you are coming to New York. This is also very important. You are giving more importance to the role and contribution of New York in promoting and defending the human rights. And here, making the link about UPRs and that Universal Periodic Review of the Council on Human Rights, and also the implementation of our international commitment within the UN instruments and international law. I would like to, I have a question. How Scotland is implementing the recommendation that are given to the UK government within the UPRs? Are you directly involved when UK is preparing its national reports? Do you get a recommendation directly from the central government, from London? Or you have, as you said, you have your own national framework plan for promoting and defending human rights independently of what the government of London is taking as commitment or recommendation to be implemented. Once again, thank you very much and welcome in New York.
Thank you very much for your very kind comments. I really appreciate them. In answer to your question, very briefly, a bit of both is the answer. So Scotland has its own frameworks around human rights, some of which I've spoken about today, but we will also contribute to UK reports on its human rights activity and recommendations where they affect responsibilities of the Scottish Government. We will respond to that as part of that overall UK framework as well.
Thank you, Madam First Minister. This is I'm not used to saying First Minister. This is something very special. No, thank you for this introduction. I mean, for us, it's very important that below the UN members, there is a network of those who really defend and trying to promote human rights. So far, I was just aware of human rights cities, and therefore very appreciative of Scotland declaring itself as a country of human rights. I would have a question in the Brexit context, what it means in the future for you. I mean, in the moment Brexit becomes a reality, so the European Court of Justice and the Lisbon Treaty will be out of jurisdiction for the UK, but not the Council of Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights, and European Court of Human Rights. So I was curious when you said that you also want to put into law human rights, I don't know, covenants, but how far is that possible for you with the devolved powers you have? And how far is human rights covered by that? And if it's covered by that, how far can you also make international agreements in this area? That would be curious about, to see how you do that. I mean, because we're a federal state, also Austria, and within their matters, they have the right to international agreements as long as it concerns their powers. Will that go as far as being able to adhere to international covenants, international? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and your summary of the impact of Brexit is a very good one. The jurisdiction of the ECJ, the Lisbon Treaty, will cease if the UK leaves the EU. I still have a scintilla of hope that might not happen, but we'll see. Of course, the UK will continue to be signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights, although worryingly, there are voices in the UK in certain parties who would argue that the UK should also look to withdraw from the ECHR, and I hope that's not something that happens, but we've got to be vigilant about that. In terms of Scotland, Scotland's government and Scotland's Parliament has competence in a range of what we describe devolved issues, and in those areas of competence, we have the ability to incorporate, for example, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that we become subject within our domestic law to the requirement to comply with those conventions as we exercise our devolved responsibilities. And that's what we're seeking to do. Right now, in Scots law, it's only the European Convention on Human Rights that is incorporated into our domestic law. In terms of international agreements, Scotland doesn't have the devolved competence for international relations. So we unfortunately cannot strike international treaties between Scotland and other independent countries. But we are always looking for ways to sort of get round that. And we often do look to strike agreements with, for example, here in the United States, with states, with other subnational governments across Europe and elsewhere. Yesterday, for example, I signed an agreement with the Governor of New Jersey on tackling climate change, something I've also done with the Governor of California. So we have that ability, and what we try to do is operate as expansively in these areas as we can, if it is about furthering things, whether it's the fight against climate change or protecting human rights, that we consider to be important for us domestically and internationally as well.
Would you kindly introduce yourself?
Is this on? Hi, I'm a journalist. My name's Madeleine Cairns. I'm also from Scotland, as you will probably hear. As a journalist, so my question relates to women's rights specifically. So as a journalist, I've spoken to many feminists and particularly lesbians from the UK and the US who are very concerned about the implications of legally enshrined gender identity for women and children's sex-based rights and protections. So I'd like to ask if the First Minister understands woman to mean adult human female or as a person who identifies as a woman, and how Scotland plans on addressing some of the obvious concerns that come from this question.
Well, this is a very live debate in Scotland right now, as it is across the UK and in many other countries. Scotland has plans to bring forward legislation to simplify the process around gender recognition. It doesn't change the fundamentals, it simply makes that process easier, and I hope intends to put more dignity into that process for people who are going through the process of changing their gender. This debate has become, in many countries, very polarised, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to depolarise it. The reason why I think it's important to simplify the procedure around gender recognition is that many transgender people go through extreme difficulties in a whole range of different ways, and I think we should be doing everything we can to address that and to recognise their rights and to allow them to express those rights as fully as possible. In my view, some of the concerns that are expressed on the part of women and feminists, while we have to listen and understand that, I think many of those are misplaced. As an ardent, passionate feminist, and have been all of my life, I don't see the greater recognition of transgender rights as a threat to me as a woman or to my feminism. But I think there is a need to bring different parts of this debate together and to try to find the way forward that respects the rights of transgender people and recognises and hopefully addresses some of the concerns that are expressed.
Good morning, Luigi, Mission of Italy. My compliments for your presentation and even more for your direct answers to the questions. I appreciate a lot of this frank discussion. I'm a judge in profession working now at the Mission, and I'm very interested in having your comments about which are the main threats to human rights in Scotland, and if you can have some focus on prison system, judicial system, and how this, also civil justice, how this is working in your country to enhance the protection of human rights. It should be very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I like to think that human rights are not under severe or direct pressure in Scotland. We have a significant consensus around the importance of human rights and the importance of protecting human rights. But we cannot be complacent about that. We must be vigilant. And largely because of the incorporation of the European Convention into our own domestic law, which has been the case since the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, around issues of human rights in prisons. There have been a number of court cases that have ensured that we comply fully, and that can be uncomfortable for governments at times, but it is right that that process is in place, and we need to make sure that we are responding to any areas where we are seen not to be completely in compliance. One of the big debates, though, that I'm very keen to advance in Scotland is to see human rights as not just very important about the human rights of people in our criminal justice system or in the wider judicial system, but to encourage people to see human rights as much broader and wider than that. Human rights are about how people are treated in a care home, if an elderly person is in a care home, or in the National Health Service. It's about whether people have the right to housing and food on the table. So we are trying to open up the debate about human rights to much more explicitly encompass social and economic rights. And I think that's an area where Scotland can and is increasingly leading the way. And it's why we are keen, although again, this inevitably brings pressure on governments and public agencies, the kind of pressures on government through the incorporation of the European Convention by incorporating other international treaties more directly into domestic law, we raise the bar on human rights right across the piece, and that's the direction I hope Scotland will go in the next few years.
With us here this morning. My name's can you hear me? My name's Caoimhní Croher from the Irish Mission, and I just had a kind of a practical question, and I wondered if you could talk us through a little bit the nuts and bolts and the mechanisms by which the devolved governments can influence human rights policy at the UK level. Thank you.
Well, we do that in a range of, we can do that in a range of formal and informal ways. I think the most important thing we do is in our devolved competencies, we make sure or seek to make sure that we are properly respecting and defending human rights. Clearly, though, we seek to have a voice and have an influence in the direction of travel for the United Kingdom government. There has been debate, as you will know, in the United Kingdom over the last couple of years about the European Convention on Human Rights and whether the UK should still be a signatory and subject to all of that. And the Scottish Government has been very vocal around not just seeking to persuade UK governments not to move away from that, but also to ensure that the voice of the Scottish Government would be heard formally in any decision about that, because it would impinge very directly on areas of devolved responsibility. So much of that influencing will be informal rather than formal, but we seek to do it as effectively as we can.
Thank you, First Minister. I'm the DPR of Cyprus. Just if I could ask a couple of questions. The first relates to the assumption of international obligations in the area of human rights. The UK, as the subject of international law, assumes these obligations. In the hypothetical scenario where Scotland is in breach of some of those obligations, how is that addressed in the devolved context of government that you have in the UK? My second question relates to the European Convention of Human Rights. There has been talk of repealing the Human Rights Act. Do you think there are some options for Scotland in terms of the territorial scope of application of the treaty if the UK does decide to leave the treaty? My last question, I don't know if I'm allowed to poke the elephant in the room, but you yourself have spoken about the possibility of another INDIREF, and I wanted to ask you, there's a lot of nervousness around among member states, nation states, when anybody talks about breaking away from a state. And I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit about the legal basis for seeking independence, and how you plan to ensure that if this happens, it will be in accordance with international law and it will not result in any further disputes after that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to address each of these questions in turn. In terms of international obligations, the United Kingdom is the member state and the country responsible, but in summary, within our domestic arrangements, if it was a breach occasioned by something the Scottish Government had done or not done, the Scottish Government would be, expected to face the consequences and take the action to put that right. So, for example, to use, it's not in the human rights sphere, but to use the example of regulations and directives from the European Union, although the UK is the member state, if Scotland is not complying with an EU directive or regulation, the infraction proceedings, it would be Scotland that would be expected to take the remedial action, and that's how it operates within our domestic context. In terms of the question about the Human Rights Act, firstly, I should say I fervently hope that that is not a move that the UK will make to repeal the Human Rights Act or to distance itself in any way from the European Convention framework. If that was to happen, though, two points I would make about Scotland in that context, and I'll try not to get too technical here. I would take the view, and that would impinge on Scotland's devolved responsibilities, and therefore within the conventions that govern relationships between the Scottish and UK governments, that is something that would require the consent of the Scottish government through a convention that we have in place. I think it's fair to say the UK would probably take a different view to that, but that would be a very intense debate, and we would seek to influence that and have our voice heard on that as far as possible. We would also look to what we could do within our domestic responsibilities to replicate the Human Rights Act in Scottish legislation. And I mentioned earlier on the work that Professor Alan Miller has led for us, which makes that recommendation anyway, that Scotland should seek to embed in its own legislation a human rights framework. And that's what we are now taking forward as a recommendation. Hopefully that doesn't have to be a response to the repeal of the UK Human Rights Act, but it could be part of a response should we need that if that was to happen. On the question about independence, I think there will be another Scottish independence referendum, and I think Scotland will choose to become an independent country. The experience of the last couple of years around Brexit, I think, has made the very basic democratic argument for Scotland being independent an even stronger one than it was back in 2014. I don't, and never have done, really see Scotland becoming independent as breaking away. If Scotland is an independent country, it will still be part of the British Isles. Our closest friends and neighbours will be the other members of the British Isles, and we will cooperate closely with England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. I, as First Minister, already sit around the British-Irish Council table with two independent countries, the UK and the Republic of Ireland, the devolved nations of Scotland, Wales, and not at the moment because it doesn't have a functioning government, but when it does, Northern Ireland, and the Crown dependencies. If Scotland becomes independent, we would still be around that same table. We would just have changed our status from being a devolved country to an independent country. So those relationships will always be important. It's Scotland participating more on a basis of equality. And of course, being independent would allow Scotland to play a bigger part in multilateral organisations, the EU, the UN and others. So rather than breaking away, independence offers the opportunity for Scotland to become a much bigger player in these multilateral institutions and actually amplify our voice in the world. So it's about Scotland joining something rather than breaking away from something. In terms of your comment about the legal basis, in 2014 when Scotland had an independence referendum, it was an entirely legal, constitutional, consensual process. The United Kingdom government and the Scottish government, we were on very different sides of the debate, but we came together to agree the process by which Scotland could constitutionally and legally decide whether or not it wanted to become independent. And in doing that, I think we set a model for the rest of the world in how these issues can and should be determined. And, countries cannot, in my view, should not try to suppress the right of any nation or people to self-determination. They may not want countries or peoples to make certain choices, but that right to self-determination is one that I think is and should be enshrined. So agreeing legal and constitutional ways of allowing these decisions to be taken is important, and that should be the model and the framework for any future Scottish referendum as well.
First Minister, Peter Smith's my name. I'm from Australia, but I'm a resident of Scotland. I live in Prestwick. I have a Scottish wife.
My mother's from Prestwick.
Very good. And I have two Scottish grandchildren. which I'm concerned about, and I'm concerned here about parents' rights. I know that my daughter would not want her minor children to be taken from her if they decided to change their gender or sex. What is your view on parental rights in these matters?
I would agree that children should not be taken from the parents in those circumstances. I'm not sure if there is something more lying behind your question.
Well, in some jurisdictions this has occurred, where children have been taken into care because the parents do not want gender reassignment, drugs and all the rest of it done to their children, because 80% of adolescents grow out of these things as they mature.
Well, I don't want to get too deeply into that debate, because we could probably be here for the rest of the day talking about that. But, you know, I'm a great believer. So let me say, nobody wants to see children be taken away from parents, and, you know, nobody wants to see parental rights not being given appropriate respect. But I'm also a great believer in the rights of children and young people. And, you know, we've been talking here this morning, I've been talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think it's really important that we also give recognition. And, you know, I'm not sure that I would quite as glibly talk about, you know, young people growing out of things. I have the privilege of speaking to so many young people, including, you know, transgender young people, you know, gay and lesbian young people, and the difficulties and the challenges that they face in being themselves, and they have a right to be themselves, can be considerable. And I think our duty is to help and support them, not make the challenges they face even more difficult. One of the things I'm very proud of as First Minister, we're a country that has a very good record on LGBTI rights, and we've become the first country in the world to embed LGBTI education into the school curriculum. And I think that's really important, and it's grounded on that, you know, respect for the rights of children and young people.
And you respect people's religious belief, not to accept these things?
Of course I do, but, you know, when you obviously, you know, you frequently in lots of different contexts and situations come into a situation where different rights are in conflict with each other. And I absolutely respect people's religious rights, but, you know, there is a very legitimate debate about whether one person's religious belief should then determine how somebody else lives their life, and their ability to live their life as the person they want to be and in the way they want to do. And, you know, what I mentioned a moment ago about the embedding of LGBTI education in our school curriculum, that came about because different interests, including the churches in Scotland, came together to look at how we take forward these issues in a way that is rooted in the rights of children and young people, and is rooted in a sense of respect and dignity for people who just want to live their lives as the people they want to be. And I think that's really important.
Government of Scotland for hosting such a roundtable. It's a pleasure to be able to speak on such a personable level. My name is Connor Mason. I'm with the NGO Burma Task Force. So my question concerns international human rights, specifically that of the ongoing crisis concerning the persecuted Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar and the refugees in Bangladesh. In my experience of reaching out to European civil society in the hopes of creating an international network or coalition of civil society members to stand against this issue, I have been met with a fairly muted response. And so I was wondering, I'm very encouraged to hear your ambition and your determination to uphold human rights and to lead by example within the context of Europe. So I was wondering what exactly the Scottish government's thoughts were on this issue, what its stances were, and if it was able to make any statements about this conflict, or be able to make any statements against the people who are exacerbating this conflict. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry that you've had that muted response, because I think these are, you know, some very big and very serious issues. The Scottish Government has made many statements in the past. I have personally, about the plight of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and we have condemned the behaviour towards them, the atrocities towards them, and look always to be a voice standing up for oppressed minorities wherever they happen to be. And we'd be very, keen to talk to you and explore whether Scotland and the Scottish Government could become part of the coalition you're trying to build there. I think it's incumbent on governments not to turn a blind eye where egregious human rights abuses are taking place, and not to indulge as often as sometimes happens in diplomatic silences where these kind of atrocities are taking place. And we'd be happy to look at what bigger role we can play in that.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. I'm delighted to meet you. I'm actually from the United Kingdom, not from Scotland or from London, but I welcome you. I'm part of civil society, but I'm not going to speak in my capacity as civil society. I'm going to speak in my capacity as a barrister of law and international lawyer. You've said that Scotland welcomes everybody, and you're welcoming everybody into Scotland. What is your policy regarding refugees in view of the global refugee crisis? How does the government of Scotland deal with the issue of xenophobia, not welcoming refugees to your country? I'm speaking in that capacity because I was a former refugee myself. I was a Biafran refugee, and we had asylum in the United Kingdom over 50 years ago. How does Scotland view, firstly, the global refugee crisis? What number of refugees do you actually have in Scotland from the crisis? For example, refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Africa. I know too well what it was to be a refugee in the 60s in England when we really were not welcome being a Biafran refugee. How do you, firstly, view the refugee crisis? Secondly, are refugees actually welcomed into Scotland, and how will they be integrated into the Scottish society? Thank you, Minister.
Okay, thank you for what is an extremely important question. The refugee crisis is one of the biggest moral as well as practical challenges facing the world, and I use these words deliberately. I think countries have a moral obligation to give support and sanctuary and refuge to people who are fleeing war or famine or persecution. And I hope that Scotland is a place where refugees feel welcome. Just for some context, Scotland within the UK does not determine the rules and regulations about who is permitted to enter the UK. Immigration and policy around asylum and refugee status is a matter determined by the UK government. But we encourage the UK government to do as much as possible to welcome refugees, and I think it could do much more, and Scottish government would be very keen to do more within that context. In terms of the to illustrate this with an example that you used, Scotland has, on the Syrian resettlement programme, Scotland argued that the United Kingdom should welcome a much higher number of Syrian refugees, and still would like to see them do that. But in terms of the numbers that did come to the UK, a disproportionate number came to Scotland because we were very keen to welcome them, and we have very strong integration programmes in place led by our local authorities, with civil society playing a big part in that. And there are Syrian refugees in Scotland right now making an absolutely fantastic contribution to our country in many different ways. And that's one of the things that I think we should always remember, that yes, countries who welcome refugees are doing something for those people, but we gain something as well, because we're gaining skilled and talented people who want to give back, and it's a two-way process, and I'm very proud of the welcome we give to refugees. I would say I'm not complacent about the fact that they will sometimes experience racism and xenophobia in Scotland as they will elsewhere, and we must always be determined to counter that, and I hope that we always do.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Valerie Levy, and I represent the International Federation on Aging here at the United Nations as a member of the Committee on Aging and the UN Committee on Human Rights. I have two questions. My first is for Minister Sturgeon. The efforts of the International Federation on Aging, and indeed aging advocates around the globe for the past few years, has been to promote a convention on the human rights of older persons. We advocated strongly during the development of the Sustainable Development Goals to have aging, older persons, all ages included in the wording of the SDGs, which was, I can tell you, not a race on roller skates through the park here at the United Nations. My question for you, Minister, is you indicated that the UK is the member state. What is Scotland's view, opinion on a convention for the rights of older persons, human rights of older persons, and how much influence would Scotland have on the UK's decision to adopt such a convention? And for Assistant Secretary Gilmore, my question is, the President of the General Assembly's 10th annual open-ended working group on aging will commence on April 15. Do you have any suggestions, caveats, opinions for the Aging Network on how we can move the discussion on a convention for the human rights of older persons beyond the talk stage and into one of even minimal action steps? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a really important and timely question. You know, most countries in the Western world have aging populations, and often the narrative and the debate around that focuses on the challenges that brings to societies and to governments. Instead, it's something we should celebrate. You know, people are living longer and able to make a valuable contribution longer than has ever been the case before. And a focus on the rights of older people, I think, is very welcome. So in answer to your question, personally, I would be sympathetic to the idea of a convention being adopted, and if it was, I would be supportive of the UK adopting that. And I'm happy to give you an assurance today that I will raise this issue with the UK government and ask what their view is on it is, and whether we can do more collectively as different countries within the UK to push that forward.
And thank you very much, Valerie, for the question to me. There is a definite realization in our office in New York, I mean, not New York, but the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that we haven't emphasized enough the rights of the aged, and we're going to do more. I'd be very happy to have a separate meeting with you prior to the opening of the session on the 15th of April. So we could follow that up.
Thank you very much. And the International Federation on Aging and the Committee on Aging is more than willing to provide as much information or any kind of briefing materials that might be helpful, and we welcome that chance to meet with you.
So maybe I could ask the last question. It's a very general one, First Minister. At a time, and it's both a cause and a consequence of the pushback against human rights that we see, we find democratic politicians, and not just of the nationalist sort that you've convincingly explained that you're not a member of that type of nationalist, but a broad selection of parliamentarians and politicians have decided that human rights is not a popular issue to raise, and that they're not particularly likely to be elected if they stress the rights of refugees and immigrants and minorities. How is it that you've actually been able to do that, and you haven't paid a price electorally for that? What would you say? What advice would you give to other politicians who would like to have a more vocal, a more principled approach to human rights, but just basically fear that their electorates are not going to reward them for that?
Well, my advice, and I give it very humbly, is have the courage of your convictions. Particularly in the world we live in today, I don't think we can afford, those of us who believe in human rights, who believe that immigration and free movement is something to be valued, I just don't think we can afford to pander to the forces that are going in the opposite direction, because if that happens, then we will all end up in a place that we don't want to be. One of my personal views is that if politicians of all stripes in the UK had been prepared to make the case and seek to persuade the electorate of the arguments around immigration more forcefully, we may not have had the vote to leave the European Union. And therefore, we see in the Brexit vote what can happen if politicians are not prepared to have the courage of their convictions and make the case. Politics is, the art of persuasion. Politicians, of course, are servants of the people, and if the people don't like what you're doing, they'll get rid of you. That is democracy. But there's also a duty on politicians to seek to persuade and to put forward a case for what we believe is in the overall interests of our countries and of the world. And politicians that are not prepared to do that on difficult issues should probably look for another profession to pursue, in my view.
Thank you very much indeed. That very much reflects the view of us in our office at the UN. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your views with us. It's been a very useful occasion. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming, ambassadors.